There we go. Oh, I forgot to tell you what I'm doing. I'm just going to introduce you first and like introduce everything else, and then I'll let you share your screen. We'll go from there.
Perfect.
All right.
You want me to admit them?
I'm trying to. Okay. We will go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone. We're still waiting for people to come in through the waiting room. So as you're coming in, we'll kind of hang out here for a little bit. But this is going to be our third session of the Small Dairy Herd Management series. So this series is running all the way through December 2nd, and it will touch on different portions of the dairy industry on a very small scale. So if you're interested in starting your own farm at home or just having a family cow, this is for you. So today's session, again, is session 3. This one is all about forages and feeding. So we will kind of start on a broad scale just to give an overall introduction of the topic, and then we'll bring it back down to match that small herd goal. All right. So this is our team for the series. I've had a good number of colleagues join me to talk about different subjects that they're experts in. So we'll have one jump on for a couple different sessions. Today we will have Mackenzie Luther with us, and I will give you a brief introduction of her in just a minute. So like I said, the goals of our webinar for the entire series is to just give an introduction. So if you have not ever been involved in the dairy industry, whether it's on a large or small scale, we're going to teach you more about that, mainly in Missouri, but across the nation as well. We'll also talk about how to best manage that. We're going to talk in step-by-step sections to kind of ease into that so it's not too overwhelming. And then no matter if you are an experienced farmer or somebody new to agriculture in general, we're going to try to make it applicable to everyone. And then since all of you guys are on Zoom with us, let me show you how to type in a question if you have one. So if you look out on your screen, you'll see a chat box kind of in the bottom bar on the left-hand side. All you have to do to send this question is click on it, type your question in the box and hit enter, and it will come in to us where we can see it immediately. Or if you have questions after the webinar, my contact information will be on here. Mackenzie's contact information will be up here. So feel free to contact either of us and we can help you out. Okay, so now that housekeeping is kind of done, let me introduce myself really quickly. If you haven't been on any of the past sessions, hi, my name is Chloe. I am the Regional Dairy Field Specialist for MU Extension. So I'm in the Southwest region and I handle basically east of 65, so Springfield all the way out to West Plains. And then just besides being a dairy field specialist, I also help on the soil and water committees, fair boards, and any other things that deal with dairy agriculture. So my master's is in agriculture, but I studied more of cattle reproduction. So that is my area of interest, specifically endocrinology. So if you have any of those questions, feel free to send them my way as well. Okay, so those of you that are on here, if you would like to, you can unmute yourself and answer this question or send it to us in the chat. I'll give you just a couple minutes to do that. So the question is, what is your experience with dairy farming and what are you looking to do or where to go with dairy? So you're welcome to send those in the chat or unmute and talk. We have a small group today, so you guys can interrupt us at any time. Okay, and we will kind of leave that up for discussion. So think on it. If you come up with an answer, just send it our way. Okay, let me introduce you to our speaker of the day. So with us, we have Mackenzie Luther. This is one of my friends and colleagues now that works in extension. We met each other in undergrad and have since kept a good close relationship, and she has experience in dairy and forage as well. So she works in Davie County in North Carolina. She's a livestock agent. So her background is pasture, poultry, swine, cattle, and local produce. Why she's here with me today is she married into a dairy farming family and has a lot of experience there as well. So she graduated from the University of Mount Olive with her bachelor's in ag production systems, and she's currently working on her master's in animal science. So she's studying tall fescue as well as some nurse crop establishment. So I thought she would be a wonderful person to come on with us today to talk about forages and feeding. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Mackenzie.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So let me get my screen shared. Maybe. All right. Can everybody see that all right? Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you, Chloe, for letting me participate in this today. I'm excited to be here. At any point during this, just feel free to put something in the chat or just come out and ask it. I know we have a small group today, so just feel free to ask me any questions or wait till the end. But like Chloe said, I'm Mackenzie Luther. I'm an area livestock agent here in North Carolina. So I cover 2 counties that are about the central part of the state. And I mainly just cover all different types of livestock, but dairy is kind of near and dear to my heart. Grew up around dairy, showing cows, and then married into a dairy family. So it's lots of time on the farm, as well as my family's farm. All right, so we are going to kind of just talk about grazing cattle and different types of forages for your dairy herd. So this will be just a broad overview, but it kind of gets the wheels rolling and just kind of starts a discussion for it. So to start, grazing cattle is the process of allowing the animal to harvest the forage on its own. So typically animals, cows especially, are very social animals, so they like to move within the same group, and they tend to go to the same area that they're comfortable with. So they don't necessarily want to venture out of their typical routine. We kind of have to force them to do so, but they'll tend to graze the same area or visit the same location frequently. But our goal is to manage their grazing behavior to increase the utilization and optimize the plant and animal productivity. So we want to be getting the most out of that animal as well as our forage system. So it's important to know what your farm's carrying capacity is, or their stocking rate, stocking density, so we can utilize them and that forage to get the best potential out of them. So you need to kind of know when it's just important to start grazing and then kind of when to stop. And this is kind of crucial to have a plan before you start putting them out there on the field. Or if you already have them out there, to kind of reevaluate what's going on. But you need to be flexible and be willing to adapt to changing circumstances. Like this week, we've had really bad weather. Well, we've not really had any weather. We've not had rain, I think, in about 2 months. So it's kind of, everything's kind of drying up. So we've had to reevaluate our grazing plans at home. So to start, some different types of grazing, continuous grazing. So in that picture down at the bottom is an example of continuous grazing. So you can kind of see there's a sacrificed area, which I'm standing like at the entrance at the gate. And you can see that area right there is kind of their sacrificed area. But then those cattle are just allowed to graze all over that pasture. And I think was 40 acres is what the producer had told me, that they can just have free range. But continuous grazing, so they have access to the entire pasture at all times. Nothing is blocked off. There's minimal fencing, so you really just have that one perimeter fencing. But it's not suitable for all forage species, so you want to be mindful of what you're planting. And we do talk about that a little later on in the PowerPoint about different forages you can utilize. Creep grazing, this is beneficial to allow your young animals to pass through a small fencing or open or a gate. Most utilize this, in the summer months and when they're fixing to wean. So it allows those cattle or even other species with higher nutrient requirements to have access to that better forage first. So before you have your mama cows getting on it, whether it's a beef cow system or what. Usually it's utilized for beef cows, since we move the calves for dairy. But it also allows that summer forage before weaning. So I have an example, a couple pictures on the next slide. But rotational grazing, strip or intensive, I like to always recommend rotational grazing if you have the space and equipment to do so. It just allows better for that animal, and then that forage a little bit time to rest. But some pros and cons. So with rotational grazing, they have limited access to that portion of pasture at a time. So they're not they're not allowed to pick what they want. They're kind of forced to eat everything, so that weeds and all. It gives grazing and rest periods for the forages. So you want to eat them down, and then they can have usually about a 15-day rest period before they're back on that pasture. So it allows a little bit of a regrowth for those forages. It forces animals to move over the entire pasture. It prevents them from overgrazing a preferred patch. So if there is an area that is really lush in forage and doesn't really have many weeds, they'll tend to always go back to that spot and overgraze it. By you moving them, it kind of forces them to eat whatever's there. I like to joke it's kind of like getting kids to eat their vegetables. It keeps your pasture more uniformed, so it stimulates plants to be in that younger growth phase, or your vegetative state, longer, so you get more growth out of it, and then a more uniform distribution of manure and urine throughout your pasture. Some environmental benefits of rotational grazing is that it helps reduce erosion. So you're not really having you do still have a set sacrificed area, but you're not getting a lot of those in those desired spots where cattle like to hang out. And then some management benefits. So you can have more options for different forage utilizations. So if you do have a couple perennial pastures, say fescue or orchard grass, this allows you to utilize your annual. So when your fescue may be low in production, you can add some, warm season annuals in there, and they can graze those while you're kind of stockpiling their fescue. So here is just a couple examples of utilizing rotational grazings. So it is a lot of more management and time on your part, but there are great benefits for it. So here, I was at a couple producers' place, and these cattle are used to be moved every like 3 to 5 days. So they are ready. So they're sitting there on that right there at that electric fence. There's that one wire, so we're able to kind of keep cattle in with one wire once they get trained. And I know these are beef cows, but it is a very good representation. So you can see that they're in the pasture they're in now. I mean, you can see where they've trampled it a little bit, but I mean, they didn't really eat it all down, but they're ready to move on. So they're kind of gotten used to that timing, which I think, a picture speaks 1,000 words. So I think these are really great pictures to demonstrate, using that one wire, and that they're ready to move after that short period of time. Some things to consider if you are going to do some rotational grazing is the water source. So water is very crucial. You don't want water to be really over 2,000 feet away. Ideally, we don't want our cattle walking more than 800 feet to get some water. So using these temporary waters, or using different systems like with your NRCS, they have some really great resources and cost share programs to help put in waters. Using those to kind of keep the walking down. So especially, with dairy cattle, we want them to conserve their energy to kind of make milk. So, and water is a crucial point of that. So we don't want them to have to work extra for that. So keeping that water source around 800 feet is very crucial. And then the landscape of the land. So you kind of want to follow the terrain of the land. So don't work against yourself when you're planning out your pastures. And I have a picture later on in the presentation that kind of shows how to break down your pastures. Utilize shade. So if you don't have shade, I don't know if I added one in here, but it was a great example of a temporary shade. So it was like built on a trailer. They had done it at the NC State Dairy and Beef Unit, and they just built up this shade structure, and then they can just pull it right along. Honestly, I think with a lawnmower, it's very light, but it gives the cattle access to shade as they're moving them, because there's not a lot of trees in the area. If you do have shade trees, utilize them the best you can. Equipment. So do you have access to temporary fencing? It can add up, and it can be quite costly depending on how many acres you run. But if you just have a few, it isn't too terrible to invest in those costs, and it does save you a lot on the in the long run. And then plan ahead. So if you have your cattle already, they're getting ready to move, you want to kind of be thinking before it's time to move them, where do they need to go next? So go ahead and block off maybe the next one or two sections of that pasture. And I have an example, I believe, on the next slide to kind of show how to break them down. But this is just an example of a water, so it's right on the fence line. I have seen them to where they do set right under the fence. And so that you have cattle on both sides where they're able to have access to it. But it's just a very simple watering setup, and then they're able to move it when they move their cattle. So yeah, here is a couple examples. So it can really be any way you want it. There's no set rhyme or reason of how you can design your pasture. It's really just whatever works best for you and is easiest for you. So we don't want you to necessarily have to be doing more work. So you will need to set it up where what works for your system and your time. So you can see here that there's a central watering location, but all these little blocks are different paddocks they move them to. But they have these lanes set up here. So they each paddock has access to either lane 1 or lane 2, and that they're able to just hop on into it and then go get water. And then, but all these sections are blocked off. So when they're done getting water, they go back to their desired grazing that's been allotted for that day. And then here's just kind of a basic setup. It is with multi-species. You want to graze whichever animal needs the most nutrients first if you are adding other species. So for cattle, if you're grazing sheep with them, you want to put their cattle first, and then you just kind of move them right along, and then you can go behind them and then add the sheep behind them. So when you're moving your livestock, you want to create those lanes. So like in the last slide, they have the lanes that they use for the waters. So you can utilize those if you do have them in like kind of permanent settings. So like here, these can be either permanent, so like a T-post or something. Or they could be that temporary, like them step-in posts with those pigtail step-in posts and then that poly wire. So if they are somewhat permanent, you can have them walk back out into the lane and just move them to the next, and then just block off this pot. Or if they are, completely temporary and they're just those like little step-in posts with the poly wire, you can just take them up and then move it back, or just take out a section and then move them forward and then block it off so they're not allowed to go back to that the section they were just on. But when you're creating lanes, you need to have access points. You need to think about how the livestock typically move. If you're going to need any equipment moving them. So if you are going to need, maybe a gator or something to just collect those posts or use your polywire reel, just different things like that. And then you want to kind of avoid wet areas. I know it's kind of hard to do certain times of the year, but you don't want to be marshing up anything else when you are moving them. And when you need to rotate, it's kind of you just kind of got to watch the forages. So you don't want to let cattle graze below 4 inches on your fescue. So if it does, other forages do have a different requirement. So we are talking about like millet and sorghums later on in the presentation. And so those are 10 inches. So you kind of just want to watch them, take like a forage grazing stick, and then kind of just take samples and walk out there, just stick your grazing stick down in there, and kind of see, take an average of what the pasture looks like. And then, if you are at that 4 inches pretty consecutively of pastures, you want to go ahead and move them so they're not overgrazing them. And then this is a great resource. We can share this with you at the end, but NRCS does a really great job at explaining how to do pasture scores yourself. So this is it's all online. It's just a PDF that the USDA and NRCS put out. So I highly recommend looking this up and kind of just giving it a quick read. It's quite short, and then that kind of going out and just testing your pastures and seeing where your pastures stand. So this is NC State, so I do have the Missouri one next, but this is just kind of an example of what our forage plant guide looks like. So if you're just starting out and you don't really know what forages you have, or if you want to kind of reestablish your pastures and want to plant, it's important to utilize your forage planting guide. So this is one that NC State has. I can just go on our website and type in what region I am and then what crop I have. So for this purpose, I just did in the Piedmont, since I'm in the Piedmont area, and then tall fescue, which is what we predominantly grow in our area. And then it'll give me our recommendations. For our area, it'll be, plant between around that September 15th date. But with y'all's, it's relatively the same. Y'all just have a PDF. So here is the University of Missouri's, and then you would just scroll down and pick out what forage you want to plant, and then it gives it the seeding rate and depth and all that good stuff, and whether it's cool season, warm season. And then here's just an example of that. So this is pulled from y'all's, and so we're going to be kind of talking about tall fescue. So it is a perennial cool season grass. You wanna broadcast, you're going to do 15 to 20 pounds per acre. If you're going to do drilled, you want 10 to 15 pounds. And so you want to plant before April 15th or before September 15th. So kind of similar to ours. And then to plant that a quarter to half an inch depth. So before you get planting, you want to take soil samples. And I know this is North Carolina's, but y'all's are relatively the same. You would submit them to your Department of Ag. But prior to planting, you want to take a soil sample. So depending on what you are planting will depend on how far you need to go down. But our recommendation is usually about 4 inches if you are going to do a no-till plant and use like a no-till drill. Or 6 to 8 inches if you are going to be utilizing tillage. So you want to sample 3 months prior, and that just kind of gives enough time for the agronomist to run the sample, get the results back to you, and then you can plan on if you need to get any nutrients, any lime, fertilizer, things like that. Our NCDA is running about 2 weeks. I don't know how fast y'all are getting back, but usually it's about a 2-week turnaround for us. And then you want to sample based on the layout of your land. So some areas can be dry, very different. So you don't want to do one test for all. So here's just kind of an example of how you would want to break out your samples. So as you can see here, there is about 11, I believe, samples, and you can see that they're kind of broken up. So you currently, for North Carolina, we do have free soil testing up until November. So it is very high season for folks to get those samples in before planting and fertilizing for the fall. But you can see here that they have it broken out. So you have the lowland down here, and they've kind of just broken up. So one sample for us will cover about 10 acres, but we don't necessarily recommend using one box for 10 acres if your land does look like this. So kind of take a sample with how the land lays. So you want to get one up here if this high land, this bottom land, because nutrients can vary. Depending on the slope, and this down here may be richer in nutrients than up top there. But this little guy right here in the middle walking around, that's kind of how you want to take your soil sample. So you just kind of want to go in a zigzag pattern all across the field, and you want to collect about 15 to 20 different core samples per each box. So then you'll take them, put them in a clean plastic, just basically a 5-gallon bucket, mix them all up, and then fill your box up to where the line says. And then it's crucial you mark that box with what you mark it on your sample submission form. Okay. So just to kind of switch gears now. So you've decided that you want to graze your animals, and you've taken your soil sample and you've got it back, and you kind of want to plant fescue. So this is just kind of going to briefly talk about fescue a little bit. So tall fescue was kind of introduced and got founded in 1931 at Suter Farm, so in Kentucky, and then was released to the public after some research because they realized that it was a really great forage in the Southeast. Really great forage for animals to do a lot of great production on in about 1943. So and this kind of just goes through of when the endophyte was kind of found. So, and you can see this picture down here that where that line is, it's two separate endophytes. So the E negative, it doesn't have that endophyte in there. And then the E positive, it doesn't have that endophyte. And then you can just kind of see the rest of the timeline. So there's still lots of research going on with fescue. So Kentucky 31, it is very resilient and a strong competitor for pastures, largely because of that fungal endophyte. So that's why it's been able to persist all over. Now, that grass is able to withstand and be drought tolerant and a lot of other things because of that. But it has we have noticed that it does harm our animals a little bit. But so that fungal endophyte will make the plant resilient to stress by drought, and then also limited soil nutrients, and it kind of makes it resilient to overgrazing as well. But on the flip side, we do have to take in some precautions. So if we do have a very hot field of fescue, it kind of will affect our animals. So you'll notice with them, if they are on a large patch of very toxic fescue, you'll see your cows have a rough hair coat. So about this time of the year, they've not shed off their winter coat, so it's taken longer for them to kind of shed that coat off. They'll have a lower growth rate. They'll reduce their forage intake as well as reduce their milk production. It even can affect their reproductive issues. So their pregnancy rate will drop, and then their core body temperature will increase. So you'll notice that they're panting a lot more. They're looking for that shade. They're kind of just hanging out under the shade all day. They're not really grazing. They're not going to water unless absolutely necessary. They just are trying to stay as cool as possible. I didn't put any pictures in here today, but it is can be detrimental to their hooves. So you'll see their ear tips, and then their tail switches will kind of become really short during the cold weather because they don't get that blood circulation that they're needed. And this is kind of just the fescue growing season for North Carolina. So that solid black line is a typical growing season. So in the cooler months, because it is a cool season, you'll get that peak growth around April. So it'll be growing anywhere from February to June. And then in these summers months, it's going to start laying dormant and just kind of not being as high production as other forages. And then it'll pick back up in the fall months, so September to December. And then that's when you really want to utilize your stockpiling fescue. And this is just a cool picture. I like to add. It's where you can see that endophyte. So that endophyte really stays down in the crown of the plant, and then when it in the seed. So you want to make sure you're not grazing below 4 inches when you're grazing fescue, and then not and grazing before it gets to that seed head. And then here are just a couple different varieties of different types of fescue. So novel varieties. And so you can see all the different novel varieties here. So that and then the Kentucky 31, so that's your wild type, your toxic fescue, and then the Cajun 2, that's endophyte free. So if you have questions on that later, I'd be happy to discuss that. And then Chloe, am I getting close on time?
Oh, you're doing good.
Okay. So summer annuals, you can utilize these in your grazing systems. So they help improve thin pasture stands and help begin renovation. So if you are looking to renovate your pastures to like a novel fescue, they are a great resource. But they also add forage diversity and then kind of help improve that cattle productivity. So help them increase their milk production in those summers months if you do utilize them. But some different varieties, pearl millet, Sudan grass, like a sorghum Sudan, forage cross, and then crabgrass are a few of the varieties. So the sorghum species, just to quickly go over those, you have your Sudan grass, which it's a finer stem, best used for like if you're going to dry down some hay. So if you are looking to make hay out of this for your cows, we do utilize a lot of summer annuals for baleage at our farm, mainly a sorghum Sudan or like a millet. You want to start grazing these at 24 inches and about 45 to 60 days of production. You don't want to graze below 10 inches. For sorghum Sudan, this is the Sudan grass crossed with a forage sorghum. These do have coarser stems and best used for haylage. And so you want to make sure you have the right equipment too, because they have, a thicker stem if you are using this for making hay. You want to make sure you crush that stem. But they are a little bit higher yielding than the just the Sudan grass. These do like well-drained fertile soil, so around that 6 point pH. But prussic acid can be an issue with these types of forages, and I can talk about that in a little later on. Pearl millet is a really good forage to utilize if you don't want to have to worry about the prussic acid. This does adapt better with sandier soils and a lower pH. It is a little bit lower yielding, but you can plant a higher rate if you are going to make it for hay. It is very sensitive to seeding depth, so you want to plant around a ½ inch to an inch depth. It does have a little bit of slower emergence, so maintaining your weed control is crucial. But you want to start grading this plant anywhere between 18 and 30 inches, and then still around that 45 to 60 days post-planting. And again, don't graze below 10 inches. And then with pearl millet, it doesn't have prussic acid, but it can accumulate nitrates. And I'll talk about that next. So nitrate poisoning, it can be pretty scary. It does kind of come on pretty quickly. Some forages and weeds that are susceptible to it are oats, sorghum, corn, Sudan grass, Johnson grass, beets, and some weeds. Mainly, the Sudan grass will have that prussic acid. Your oats and your millets are what's going to get that nitrate poisoning. So the kind of nitrate poisoning comes from a buildup of the nitrogen in the plant. So if you are fertilizing that very heavily, you do want to make sure that you are watching that. So the high nitrates interfere with the animal's blood's ability to carry the oxygen. So the blood, if you're not carrying oxygen, the blood kind of changes to a darker chocolate color, very different than what prussic acid will do. So how you kind of know if your animal is having nitrate poisoning, you'll have that labored breathing, some muscle tremors. They'll start staggering. You'll kind of see them fall down, and they're really kind of just gasping for breaths, panting. And then it is a very quick death if you do not catch it quickly. So at the bottom of the screen, I have two examples of nitrate tests that I had some producers send me last week because they had one was a oats and then one was a millet, I believe. So the one on this. So the one on the top was millet, and the one on the bottom was oats. So the ideal percentage, we want really 0, but that's not always possible. But around that 0.2% or 2,500 ppm. So less is ideal, but that's where it's a safe number for them to consume. Anything over that, really over that 0.5, it is very toxic to the animals. So I have a chart explaining that in like a slide or two. But this one down here, that 0.64, so we had to advise that he could not feed that to his animals. So it's always important to do a test. So anything under around that 5.5%, you can kind of dilute that forage and feed it in very small increments, and mixed with something that it does not have nitrates in it. But excess realized I had to type it there. Excess fertilization or environmental stressors can lead to high nitrates in forages. So droughts, floods, different things like that. Usually a drought will cause it, and then excess fertilization. And bad thing about these is that they like to stay with the plant. So even if you do cut it for hay, it is very stable in hay. So even a month out. So if you say you cut it, you store it, you dry it down, even a month out, it can still be very high in nitrates. So it's always important to get your hay analysis done or your fresh forage analysis done with your department. And siling it does reduce it a little bit, but not a lot. So it's still important to kind of test, because you never know. You can't tell by just looking at it. I wish we could. So with prussic acid poisoning, so in your sorghum species, so that Sudan grass, sorghum, Johnson grass, and even cherry trees can cause prussic acid. The cells damaged by that cyanide that's formed. So freezing or drought is really when this kind of causes the onset of it. So we typically say, since we have been in a drought in North Carolina these past month, we've not been able, we've couldn't recommend grazing that because it is a very crucial time. So drought and and frost really just kind of sends that plant into a stressor, and so it produces that, and that can be very just as detrimental to the animals. So the cyanide interferes with cellular respiration. And then instead of that chocolatey color, it turns your blood, like the animal's blood, like a cherry red. So it forms in the plant when they're stressed. The hydrocyanic acid is very toxic, and then it'll volatilize during that hay cutting, but reduce in siling. So it does decrease a lot quicker, and when you make hay out of it, than it does as nitrates. So here's just a quick little chart to kind of go over nitrates. So that 0.0 to 0.25, it's safe for most of all animals. And then as you go up higher, you get to an extreme risk where you can't even feed it at all. So how to kind of mitigate this? You want to make sure your cattle are full. So if you do know that a field is higher in nitrates, before you turn them out there, you want to kind of make sure that they have gotten full before they go out there, so they just don't go out there and purge themselves. Graze that area lightly. So you should be supplementing. So if you are grazing on a millet that is bordering that 0.5, you want to add another supplement out there. So maybe just give them a little bit of access at a time. That's where that temporary grazing comes in. So you're only allowing them small parts at a time, but dilute it with different hays or different grains. So their forage is not their entire diet if it is very high. And then just adapt them gradually to the new sections, and then always test. So if you suspect something, always test. It is crucial. A test will save you thousands of dollars in the long run. And then I'll quickly just go over these just because Chloe will be talking about this. But for the ruminant feed pyramid, so high quality forages and grains are the base. So then you want to add, after that, you add fats and rumen degradable proteins, and then other additives depending on what you need for that cow, whatever they're so for dairy cows, they're going to be a little bit different than beef cows and going to need different nutrients. But you want to meet that cow's nutritional need while maintaining her health. So you want to optimize her milk production, fat, and protein, but you also want to accomplish this economically. So utilizing your forages are crucial to your base of operations. So if it's there, utilize it, you have it, and it's not necessarily free to you, but it is a cheaper resource than having to buy a lot of other grains, since the cost of everything has just skyrocketed. But you want to use that forages as your base, and then build on that. And so this is just a quick rundown, but Chloe will talk a little bit more about this, but you can match your forage needs. So that's why that test is so crucial. Depending on whatever you have, whether it's fescue, you're doing summer annuals, cool seasons, you can match that forage to your cow's need, and so what she needs during her different stage of production. So some benefits of pasture feeding, it does help decrease the cost on equipment, fuel, and bedding. So if you don't have access, to a freestyle barn, since this is, just a handful of cows you're doing either for homesteading or something else, you can reduce the housing cost, less manure handling because you're utilizing your forage and putting all that back out in there. So it's decreased in fertilization that you have to buy. And then increased exercise for the animals and the health. So they're, able to, walk around, roam freely out in the pastures. Some limitations, maintaining that high milk yield. So your production does fluctuate depending on the forage they're on and the different types of year. Maintaining the quality and the yield of the field for the entire season. So this can be a headache sometimes, depending, if you are in a drought or if you're in a flood season. Those pastures can be very finicky to that. And then the length of the growing season. So not always, depending on what they're on, won't necessarily match up to the cows' production season. So here's just a quick study. As you can see, grazing animals, they do produce a little bit lower milk. This was on a much larger scale than what most are probably going to be doing for their backyard herd. But you can see it is a decreased production, but not necessarily a whole lot. So if you are, a larger scale dairy, you may want to consider those numbers and supplementing other feed additives with them. But I think it is, a good start to utilize your grazing if you have it. And then you kind of just match this up. So depending on the time of the year and when you're calving, you can just match up those forage grazing systems to this. So this is a really good calendar. I like calendar, a really good diagram that I like to use to match up different forage systems too. But I know I ran through those last couple of slides fairly quickly, but I didn't want to encroach on Chloe's presentation. But if that's all for me. I know I ran through that fairly quickly, but if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or reach out to me. Happy to answer any questions. Thank y'all so much for having me today.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. I love that even though we are states away, grazing is grazing and utilization is utilization, and matching that animal production cycle to the forage production cycle is so important. So if you guys have any questions for Mackenzie, you're welcome to stick around and ask those, or you can email her. I will put her information back in the chat as well. But yeah. So Mackenzie, you're free to stick around if you'd like to. I'll open us back up for questions at the end of the presentation, but we will kind of just jump back in and finish up our talk about feeding today. So when I was thinking about this, being a dairy specialist, my first thought goes to rations and conventional dairies, but that's not necessarily our goal with that 1, 2, maybe a 3 cow herd. So let's talk about a couple different terms that I'm going to go over just in case you're not familiar with them. So the first is TMR. So what that is a total mixed ration. So basically it's just a formulated meal that a cow can eat in one bite and get every single nutrient that she will need. So instead of just having grass consumption or grain consumption, this is a big giant smoothie, if you will, for them. And then guaranteed analysis. This will come up when we're talking about what is actually in our feed. Oh, I forgot to change a couple of those definitions. So I will send this corrected slide to you guys as well. But we'll talk about guaranteed analysis, and it's really going to break down what is actually in that feed. And then dry matter, again, sorry, I forgot to give you guys a good definition. But the dry matter percentage is take away all the moisture out of the feed. That dry matter is what's left to constitute that consumption. And then lastly, total digestible nutrients. You'll hear this a lot as TDN. All that is just an estimated energy value of that forage or feed stuff. So let's talk about feed tags and how to read those labels when you're deciding what to buy for your herd. So feed tag labels, all of them are regulated by the Association of American Feed Control Officials. So AFCO, if you ever hear that being thrown around, it is all regulated. So it's all the same across the board and really easy to understand. So what is on a feed tag that is required by that association? So you'll have the weight of the product. So if you're buying a 50-pound bag, it's going to say 50-pound bag. You'll have your product and your brand name. Again, that guaranteed analysis word is going to come up again, and it'll break down all the ingredients that are in that feed. They will have an ingredient list. So it may be kind of simple, and if you have rolled corn, it's just going to say corn. It's not going to tell you what kind of corn it is and or what species. It will also have that seller or manufacturer contact, so you'll know exactly who made it and where it came from. It'll give directions for use and any sort of precautionary statements. And then if it is a medicated feed, it does have to say what medication it includes. And then more than likely, you will need a vet client patient relationship or a VCPR in order to purchase those feeds. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about feed components. So when we're looking at those bags of feed, what do we want to buy? And you can read them and see all of these. So those feed tags are usually going to list those components on a dry matter basis for the guaranteed analysis. And we'll look at a feed tag picture after this slide so I can point out exactly what we're talking about. But the main things that are going to show up besides protein are going to be your crude fat, your crude fiber, your vitamins, and your minerals that are included in that feed. So crude fat's always going to be shown as a percentage. and each percentage point represents 2.25% of that total digestible nutrients. So a little bit complicated, but again, is all labeled on the feed tag. Then crude fiber is again shown as a percent, and this will give you a rough estimate of the energy levels of the feed. So usually it's around 8 to 16%. So if we think about that, if we have a higher percentage of fiber, more than likely that feed is going to be a little less digestible compared to something with 8% fiber. And then vitamins, they're always going to be shown in what's called international units. And only A, D, and E will be included on the tag. Why is that? Is because some of the vitamins, so like vitamin B, that animal can synthesize in that rumen itself. So it doesn't have to be shown on the tag. Then lastly, minerals, they're always going to be shown in macro or micro, and they'll be shown as a minimum or a maximum amount. So, and they're always usually in parts per million. So let's see that in real life just so it starts clicking and making sense. So if we check out the top of this feed tag right here, we're going to see our crude fat, our crude fiber, and our crude protein. And again, those are in percents. So our crude fiber is going to say no more than 15%. So it doesn't show you exactly how much is in there, but they just know that they didn't put more than 15% in that bag of feed. Then if we look at that vitamin A on the bottom here, again, it's in international units. And then if we look at some of our minerals, we can see that they're in here, but they're not in big enough quantities to be listed in our guaranteed analysis. So all of these feeds are going to be tested and proven by the company, and that's how they get those percentages to show you. So if we check out our next arrow, we can look at our ingredients. Now, this is not a recipe to how they made that feed, but it's going to tell you what is in it. So when it says grain products, that first ingredient there, grain products is kind of up for discussion. It could be corn, it could be brewer's grain. You don't know exactly what grain is in there, but it is a grain. And then we can keep going down the line and we can look at plant protein products. So that may be a soybean meal, but they don't have to be super specific as to what it is. Usually you can just look at it, that feed in your hand, and be like, oh yeah, there's some corn in there. That must be my grain product. And then keep going down the bottom of that feed tag. Of course, we have our feeding directions. So that really breaks it down for you depending on what category or class of production that feed is for. And then we can look at our third arrow, and that says caution. So it may just throw in a different statement of this one is selenium, and they want to advise you that excess selenium is to be avoided. And again, at the very bottom, you can see who made it and where they are. So just whenever you're looking at those feed tags, kind of just pay attention, make sure you're getting what you paid for it. There may be 2 bags of feed out there. One may be that 16% protein, one may be 14, and they may be the same price. So just make sure, like, get what you're paying for and get whatever that animal requires in the current production. So like I said, what are we getting? So in order to really know how much energy a feed contains, we need to know the total digestible nutrients. Once we know that, then we compare to the current needs of our cattle. So if we think back to the graph that Mackenzie shared, that very last part of the lactation cycle, those in their peak lactation, they're going to have a lot higher TDN requirement than those in our mid gestation. So the one thing, unfortunately, that a feed tag does not list is TDN, but we can calculate it from what components are listed on the tag. So I will show you how to do that. So math, yes, scary, but you can do it. So these are our TDN calculations. You can do one on a dry matter basis, just knowing if you know the ADF percentage of that feed. So ADF is acid detergent fiber. So it's just our crude fiber broken down into 2 different types. If you do not know that, you can get like a rough target TDN value to work from. So if you call that feed company or email them, those are questions that you can ask and be like, hey, what is the TDN of that fiber? Then if you get those percentages, you can use this second equation and really break it down to see what is your TDN. So this kind of can get in the weeds, but if this is something that you need help with, those feed companies can definitely break it down for you and help. or you are more than welcome to always email us for help too. So if you decide that you want to get into making a TMR or that total mixed ration on a smaller scale, you can totally do that. And you don't have to do that at the same time. So there are so many ways for a cow to consume nutrients. She can either graze, like Mackenzie talked about, and just have a rotational grazing system and be good to go. She can graze and then get supplements on the side. So if you were to set up your rotational system, but then you come out and give some cubes every now and then, that's what that would look like. Or she can consume some harvested forages and supplements separately. So if you're feeding hay and cubes, or she can do it all at the same time. So that would be our total mixed ration. So again, in the same bite, she's getting every single nutrient that she may need. So again, our little definition for total mixed ration is there. And let's talk a little bit more about what you have to have in your TMR. So when we think about it, we go back to kind of that TDN. What does she need? What does that pyramid look like to make up all of her requirements? So in a TMR, it has to have forages. You have to have your grains, your protein feeds, your minerals, and your vitamins. And then some people will even add in feed additives. So some people add molasses just to make that TMR stick together a little bit to where she can't push it around and sort out her favorite parts like trail mix. And then another big requirement is that TMR needs to be 50 to 55% dry matter just to keep those rumen bugs happy and have some forages to digest. Another thing when we think about that trail mix analogy, that needs to have somewhat similar particle sizes. If those forage pieces are huge compared to those little pieces of corn, she's going to sneak out that corn and toss all that forage aside. So if we look at this picture on the right, that is a TMR, and that's a really good example of a TMR. You can kind of see by the way that they're holding it, there's not pieces falling out. Everything looks pretty uniformly sized. So that would be a wonderful example. And then if we go back, I just lost my screen. Can you guys see my screen okay or no?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I just cannot see it now. I don't know what happened. Wait, hold. Go. All right, and then on our left-hand side, this is called the Penn State Particle Separator. So this is getting more into the research world. But all that this picture on the left is a separated out portion of that handful on the right. So by putting it in the top and kind of shaking it, like if you were trying to sift out flour, is exactly what this is doing. So that upper portion, that's going to be all of the bigger roughage particles of that TMR. The middle portion is going to be those mid-size, the lower gets even smaller, and that pan percentage is kind of like the, not dust, but those ground corn pieces, those really fine particles. So this is an ideal makeup of your TMR. Again, you can kind of see that it all looks very similar on the right, but if you really, really sort it out, it does kind of fall into different categories. So now that we know all about our TMR, how do you make one? I'm sorry, you guys, my computer is acting all kinds of crazy and does not want to show my PowerPoint on my end. Okay, let me try to stop sharing and then I will share it again. There we go. Okay, so what do you need if this is something that you want to do? So the first thing you'll need is one, a great nutritionist or your extension specialist. Ration formulation is a science. So again, remember back to what stage of production that your cow is in. This is going to be all different requirements depending on what her body is doing. If she is actively growing a calf, if she is actively milking, those nutrient requirements change. To actually make the TMR at home, you're going to need a scale to weigh out your feedstuffs. You're going to need some way to mix it, some way to deliver that TMR to the cows, and then ways to store your different feeds. So this kind of can get a little bit complicated, especially if you're doing it on a smaller scale. But I just wanted to show you guys that it is an option if that's something that you would like to do. And then maybe your TMR just looks like feeding hay and then grain, and then just mixing that up to where it's a balanced meal. So if you don't want to feed a TMR, that is totally fine. You don't have to. As long as your cattle are receiving all the nutrients that they need for that stage of production, your TMR may not be necessary. So just make sure if you elect not to do that, that you're still feeding high quality feedstuffs. Use Joe's forage test to know exactly what you're getting. And then feel free to utilize me, utilize Mackenzie, utilize a dairy nutritionist. They are here to help you create the best feeding plan for your herd in whatever stage of production you're in. So, kind of the overall statement of the day, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but you can feed your dairy cattle by grazing them, you can feed them with a ration, or a combination of both. Either way, the ideal choice is going to be whatever fits her nutritional needs and your resources the best. So, very kind of 10,000-foot overview. We can get in the weeds if you want to, but again, this is just a very introductory series if you're interested in starting your own herd. So, this is me. This is my contact information. Feel free to reach out at any time, call, email with questions. I am more than happy to help. And then our next session will be on Monday, August 12th at 12 p.m. CST. And we're going to talk about cattle health. And then my other colleague, Elizabeth Hicking, will be joining us. She's also a livestock agent with MU Extension, and she focuses more on cattle reproduction. So that'll be a great talk. If you guys have any questions, again, please send them in the chat. You feel free to unmute and chat with us a little bit. But we will stick around for just a little bit, and then we will wrap it up. Thank you guys again for joining us, and hope you learned something new. All right, and I will switch it back to my contact info just for anyone that didn't get that. If you're still hanging around, I will be sending out an evaluation and then the link when this is uploaded to YouTube so you can watch it again. Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you everyone. You all are free to go. Okay, I kicked whoever else was here out. Bless.